now for our 18th session looking at the Gospel of Luke in a series we've entitled The Saviour of the World. We're listening to the story as God told it through Luke that we might better understand the message of the good news he shares with us and in the way that he shares it with us. Feel free to ask questions. As I've just said, you can either do that in the chat window. Maybe Jack might even open things up at the end, but if not, we'll certainly take care of them when we are together next, Lord willing. So last week, you may recall, we looked at the crooked woman on the Sabbath, where the religious leaders sought to impose the rules and regulations upon the people. The true power of God works quietly yet powerfully within the hearts of men and women of faith, and it's there where the Spirit of God is at work, permeating every part of our lives, growing ever far and wide to welcome all who seek them. Some of the teachings that Jesus taught at that time. Then we looked at the strangers at the door. The general gist of this teaching is that there are many who assume that they have a place within the kingdom of God, but they're really only fooling themselves. Go and tell that fox. The whole point behind that encounter, you may recall, seems to be that Jesus will do what he will do in his own time and without influence or hindrance from others. It is God and not Herod who will determine the time and place of his death. Then we spent a little time at the house of a ruling Pharisee, and the this next section, which took over most of chapter 14 of the Gospel of Luke, took place at the house of another Pharisee and provided the setting for several parables and short stories, along with some teaching which really hit at the heart of the religious elite. Then we talked a little of the cost of following Jesus. Well, in this session this evening, we are going to be looking at the setting for some stories which Jesus told, including some of the best known of the stories which he ever told. We'll be looking at that of the lost sheep and the lost coin. Very briefly, spend most of our time this evening looking at the story of the lost son. Okay, well, let's begin by taking a look at the setting for the stories. Now, Luke tells us the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him. And the Pharisees and the scribes, they grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." The audacity of all things. Well, the setting is rather like that in which Levi was called by Jesus, you may recall. Luke told us then that Levi made him a great feast in his house, and there was a large company of tax collectors and others reclining at table with them. And the Pharisees and their scribes grumbled at his disciples, saying, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Well, Luke is very deliberately emphasizing this contrast between the tax collectors and sinners whom Jesus welcomes and, of course, with whom he eats and drinks. He's contrasting these with the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious people who grumble and criticize Jesus. So, here again, as the tax collectors and the sinners were gathering close to Jesus, people like you, people like me, yes, the tax collectors and the sinners, as they gathered around Jesus, the scribes and the Pharisees were hovering nearby. Well, this religious elite, or so they considered themselves to be, they considered themselves as being so much better than everyone else. They thought that they alone were truly righteous in the eyes of God, and they looked down on anyone who had gone astray, upon any who were friends of those who had gone astray. And so, of course, they looked down on Jesus because he freely entertained the company of the downtrodden and the outcast. He loved the losers. And they saw that Jesus welcomes sinners and eats with them. And of course, they saw that as being some kind of fault. Well, here Luke is making it clear that Jesus intends to address head on his welcome reception of sinners and the Pharisees' opposition to it. And he begins by telling a couple of short stories about things being lost and found and the joy that follows the finding of that which was lost. And then these lead into a third story, a more a more developed story in which that which was lost and had died is found and brought back to life. All three parables repeat the essential themes of the need of repentance, the finding of the lost, and the theme of, above all others, perhaps, God's joy in recovering the lost. And it's worth noting that the shepherd in the first parable, the cleaning woman in the second, and the father in the third undertake risks that, from the standpoint of wisdom and practicality, may not be advisable. And these risks are really essential to understanding all three parables. They're not parables of prudence, but they're parables of the recovery of the lost and of God's immense joy in redemption. As James Edwards puts it in the Pillar Commentary, in the first parable, the lost sheep is recovered outside the fold. In the second, the lost coin is recovered inside the house. And the third and climatic parable incorporates both of these motifs. The father must await the return of a rebellious son, and he must seek the return of a resentful one. Well, in the first two parables, the sheep and the coin, of course, do nothing to assist in their being found. Their recovery depends entirely upon the initiative of the one who seeks them. And the same determination is essential to the third parable as well. For apart from the Father's long-suffering love and endless seeking love, neither younger nor older son would be reunited with or reconciled to him. And so the love of God is seen prominently within these three stories. So let's first look at the lost sheep and the lost coin. These are two short stories. The first is about a sheep that was lost and the joy of the shepherd, which he shares with his friends and neighbors once he has brought the sheep safely home. And then the second is about the joy of a woman who finds a coin that she has lost, and it's a joy which she also shares with her friends and neighbors. Two really very simple stories, and yes, there's more that we could say about some of the details within them. Perhaps we've no time to do that today, but we will say that the joy of the shepherd and the joy of the woman stand in stark contrast to the grumbling of the religious people who were always criticizing and finding fault with the storytelling teacher from Nazareth. Well, let's read the main story on the menu for this evening, that of the lost son. And I'm going to be reading this from, well, mostly from the Good News translation. We've tweaked it once or twice along the way, but that's essentially where this is coming from. There was once a man who had two sons. The younger one said to him, "Father, give me my share of the property now." So the man divided his property between his two sons. And after a few days, the younger son sold his part of the property and left home with the money. He went to a country far away where he wasted his money in reckless living. He spent everything he had. Then a severe famine spread over that country, and he was left without a thing. So he went to work for one of the citizens of that country, who sent him out to his farm to take care of the pigs. Oh, he wished he could fill himself with the bean pods the pigs ate, but no one gave him anything to eat. And at last he came to his senses, and said, "All my father's hired workers have more than they can eat, and here am I about to starve. I will get up and go to my father and say, 'Father, I have sinned against God and against you. I am no longer fit to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired workers.'" So he got up and started back to his father. Well, he was still a long way from home when his father saw him and was moved with compassion. His father ran to him, threw his arms around his son, and kissed him. "Father," the son said, "I've sinned against God and against you. I'm no longer fit to be called your son." Oh, but the father called to his servants, "Hurry!" He said, "Bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and shoes on his feet, and then go and get the prize calf and kill it, and let us celebrate with a feast. For this son of mine was dead, but now he is alive. He was lost, but now he has been found." And so the feasting began. Well, in the meantime, the older son was out in the field. On his way back, when he came close to the house, he heard the music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked him, What's going on?" "Oh, your brother has come back home," the servant answered, "and your father has killed the prize calf because he got him back safe and sound." Well, the older brother was so angry he wouldn't even go into the house. So his father came out and begged him to come in. But he spoke back to his father. "Look," he says, "all these years I have worked for you like a slave, and I've never disobeyed your orders. Well, what have you given me? Not even a goat for me to have a feast with my friends. Oh, but when this son of yours returns, after gobbling up your estate on prostitutes, you kill the prize calf for him." "Oh, my son," the father answered, "you are always here with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be happy because your brother was dead, but now he's alive. He was lost, but now he has been found." And that, I really must say, that is one of the most beautiful stories I ever heard. and yet it has long worn a title that is both ambiguous and possibly also a little distracting. The phrase prodigal son has certainly found its way into common usage, but just what does that word prodigal actually mean? I mean, it's not exactly a word that most of us use on a daily basis. Simply speaking, it means wastefully extravagant, as in, when you spend money or use resources freely and recklessly. And that's just what the younger son did in this story. He really was, terribly prodigal. Well, as we've said, the acceptance of sinners, of those generally looked down upon and rejected by the religious leaders, it's really something of a prevalent theme in Luke's gospel, and it's in Luke's gospel alone that we find this story of the compassionate father, and it truly is a most beautiful story. And I suppose if I'd been around at the time, I might have thought it was being told about me. But of course, had I been around then, I wouldn't be here now. So let's take a closer look at what's going on in the story. We begin with the son and his inheritance. The Jewish law required the firstborn to receive a double portion. So the younger son, we're told that there were two sons, the younger son would receive a third of the estate. Now, it's likely that Jewish tradition that was later written down in what was known as the Mishnah, it's likely that Jewish tradition also allowed for the father to give away capital or property whilst retaining control of the income from that capital until his death. And that's probably the sort of thing that's happening here in the story. Of course, it is just a story, but for listeners to be able to identify with it, it needed to be based on, some sort of credible reality, as it were. So, for reasons that are yet to be disclosed, the younger son goes to his father and asks for his share of the inheritance. Now, it's difficult to think of this happening in any way other than which we might be familiar today, but it's unlikely that he, simply gave him a check or transferred the funds into his account. There would have been some deed or some means of identifying who owned which property, and it's likely that the younger son took that deed and sold it for cash. Well, the new owner would essentially not be able to take possession until the death of the father, who retained the management of the property and the use of the proceeds. But as we've said, this is just a story. So next it moves on to discuss the son and his extravagance. Now, whatever the details, it seems evident that the son had little regard for his family, and he was quite happy for the estate to be broken up. And it also seems quite evident that he had little concern for his own future, as he takes the proceeds and he heads off to a distant land where he squanders every penny. Well, as we've said already, he really was, an exceedingly prodigal chap. Well, once he finds himself away from home, he discovers opportunities and pleasures that he had perhaps never even considered before leaving his family. And there, in that distant land, he squanders his wealth in reckless living. Later, it would be said that he had wasted. One version has that which we read earlier. He gobbled up his father's estate on prostitutes. I mean, what a terrible, terrible waste. His family inheritance spent on a few moments of short lived and long regretted pleasure. There's probably a lesson here for those who are moving away from home, particularly for the first time. And the lesson is surely be prepared. The thing is, we're often far more vulnerable when we're in unfamiliar surroundings, on enemy soil, so to speak. And the younger son certainly was far more vulnerable. And it might also be worthwhile bearing in mind that for a Jew, the idea of a distant land was particularly significant. Jerusalem was seen as the place where God lived. And so the further away one went from Jerusalem, the further away one went from God. Of course, that's not how it actually works. And the prophet Jonah had shown quite clearly that it was simply not possible to run away from God. Wherever you go, he's already going to be there, which is actually a jolly good thing, although some may not think so at the time. But for this younger son, if he thought that he might be further away from God, that he might have found it easier to think of doing things that he would never have dreamt of doing back home. And so the story moves on to speak of his destitution. And things were only going to get worse. Not only did he find himself destitute, but he also found himself in the midst of a famine. All alone, totally broke, among strangers in a foreign land, starving to death, ridden with shame, devoid of all sense of worth. He really wasn't in a very good place. And with famine in the land, food prices would be through the roof. And the only work that he could find was feeding the pigs. And for a Jew, well, one could hardly think of a less desirable form of employment. I mean, not that feeding pigs is particularly desirable for the rest of us, but for the Jew it was virtually unbearable, for pigs were also ceremonially unclean. The rabbis would say, "Cursed is the man who raises pigs." What would his family have thought? And for all this, he may well have found some form of shelter, but he was still without adequate food and still without any friends, for nobody gave him anything. Well, finally, things begin to turn for the better, and the son begins to return to his senses. There's got to come a point in our lives when we realize that we're not what we ought to be. We're not only are we not what we should be, but we're not what we could be. And for the younger son, that time was now. The prophet Jeremiah once wrote, Jerusalem remembers in the days of her affliction and wandering all the precious things that were hers from days of old. When her people fell into the hand of the foe and there was none to help her, her foes gloated over her, they mocked at her downfall. Jerusalem remembers. And now in our story, the younger son remembers. As none came to his help in the depths of his destitution and despair, he remembers the precious things that were his from the days of his youth. How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough food, but I'm starving to death? Yep, finally, he'd come to his senses. He remembered how good things once were, and though he had no delusion that they might ever be as good again, he knew that there was more than enough to go around. So he says, I will get up and go to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Take me on as one of your hired hands. It was his only hope. But there's something about that rehearsed confession of the younger son which I think is particularly refreshing. There's an honesty about it which recognizes the reality of his despair. I have sinned against heaven. I no longer deserve. Our actions have consequences which we may not like, but which are the result of our own stupidity and for which we need to accept responsibility. There was no attempt to blame anyone else. There were no excuses, simply an open heart longing for acceptance once more. And I suppose that rather than try to identify all the violations or so-called sins of which the son was guilty, as if that could be possible, would be better to understand his confession as an acknowledgement that his life was simply a real mess. Whatever deeds he might have done, he had been selfish and unfaithful and foolish and reckless and probably much more besides. And of course, he really had been terribly prodigal. But sin isn't all about breaking rules and regulations. It's rather about dishonoring God, about violating his trust, spurning his love, disregarding our fellow beings. And the thing is, we're all in it together. None of us is better than anyone else. We've all sinned in as much as we've all missed the mark and fallen short of what God intends for us. My grandmother had hanging in her dining room a wooden plaque with a poem by the 19th century poet Quorkin Miller, a poem which I remembered from a very early age, and which I think undoubtedly has had, a tremendous impression upon me ever since. And this is it. It's a simple poem, and it says, "In men whom men condemn as ill, I find so much of goodness still. In men whom men pronounce divine, I find so much of sin and blot. I hesitate to draw a line between the two where God has not." Well, it was time for the son to make his return. He returns home, rehearsing his confession, and he's ready for the worst. We might say that he returns home, but if you look closely at the text, the idea is more that he's returning to his father. The contrast is not so much between being at home or being away, but rather between being with his father and being away. And heaven is really like that. It's not so much about being in a certain place, as if we could possibly identify a location for heaven as if it was some physical, destination. Of course not. It's heaven's not so much about being in a certain place as being with a certain person. It's all about the relationship we have or don't have with God the Father. But this understanding of the younger son returning to his father is brought out very clearly by what happens on his return. Jesus said that he arose and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. Let me read that again, just in case you missed the impact of this. His father saw him, presumably he'd been looking out for him. He felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. absolutely amazing. There's no anger at what he had done, no criticism, no condemnation, no "who on earth do you think you are showing your face around here?" Not a bit of it. Instead, there is compassion, embracing, and kissing for the one who's just squandered a third of the family inheritance, brought shame upon them all, and broken up the estate. Absolutely amazing. Do you know of the most delightful poem, or song as you may know it, written by Samuel Longfellow in the middle of the 19th century? You might have heard it sung before, and it's a song about this story of the compassionate father. Here it is. I mean, I'm tempted to sing it, but for your sake, I won't. But you can maybe sing along if you know the tune. Love for all, and can it be? Can I hope it is for me? I who strayed so long ago, strayed so far and fell so low. I, the disobedient child, wayward, passionate, and wild, I who left my father's home in forbidden ways to roam. I who spurned his loving hold, I who would not be controlled, I who would not hear his call, I the wilful prodigal. To my father can I go? At his feet myself I'll throw. In his place, in his house, there yet may be place, a servant's place for me. See, my father waiting stands. See, he reaches out his hands. God is love, I know, I see. Love for me, yes, even me. And though it's one of my favorite songs, in fact, I'm planning to have this at my funeral if you're around that day. Though it's one of my favorite songs, I think that it misses one significant point. The final verse begins, "See, my father waiting stands. See, he reaches out his hands." But that's not actually how the story goes. Jesus said that while the younger son was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him. Did you notice that? He ran. The father didn't stand waiting all the time. He ran to his son, not with clenched fists, but with outstretched arms, eager to embrace him. And why does he do that? Why does the father in the story have compassion and run and embrace and kiss his son? Because that's exactly how God welcomes back one who was lost and is now found, who was dead, but who now lives. And every time I read the story here, I think of the words of King David, written 1,000 years before Jesus told this story, when he says that the Lord does not deal with us according to our sins, nor repay us according to our iniquities. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his steadfast love towards those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far does he remove our transgressions from us. As a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him. Isn't that beautiful? Yeah? As a father shows compassion to his children. And yet there's so much more than compassion here. There's a real celebration with a ring on his finger and shoes on his feet that were worn out from his long journey. The prize calf is slaughtered for a sumptuous feast with music and dancing. Some might almost call the father's behavior wastefully extravagant. Yeah, maybe this is really the story of the prodigal father, huh? You remember the lost and found sheep and the lost and found coin? Well, here is the joy in heaven before the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Here's the Father expressing his joy because his child has come back to him, and no expense could possibly be spared for such an occasion as this. But there's a sad twist at the end of the story as we come face to face with the elder son. Not everybody saw it in quite the same way. Yeah, there were two brothers in the story, you remember? And the attention now turns to the older of the two, the one who has faithfully stayed at home since the beginning of the story. But he knows nothing of the Father's joy. Instead, he's filled with anger and he refuses to go back into the house and join the party. Even when his father came out and entreated him, he could only protest his own innocence and complain at what he saw was the unfairness of it all. I mean, I don't know. Maybe he feels cheated. Maybe he feels that his father is wrong for behaving in such a fashion. I think he does. I mean, after all, having spoken of the rights of inheritance of the firstborn, the law of Moses went on to speak of a stubborn and rebellious son who is a glutton and a drunkard, and how that all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. No fatted calf, no ring, no shoes, no music, no dancing, certainly no party, just plain stoning to death in order to purge the evil from their midst. It's all there in Deuteronomy chapter 21. But you see, where the law was concerned with setting in place a moral framework and a code of civil conduct, it never excluded the possibility of one turning away from rebellion and finding forgiveness and restoration and life. That was always there from the beginning. But there were always those who thought themselves better than others, and they would rather condemn than show compassion. And the Pharisees and the scribes, they were just like that older brother. They knew no joy, for they knew nothing of the mercy and compassion of God, and most certainly they thought that he was wrong for eating and welcoming and eating and drinking with those sinners and tax collectors. Listen, when God throws a party, the religious people don't want to join in because they are so consumed by their own goodness, which of course isn't really goodness at all. It's just wickedness clothed in self-righteousness. But when God throws a party, the sinners turn up, for they've come to know God's love, and they've entered into his joy, for they were dead, but now they live. They were lost, but now they are found. Oh, may God open our hearts to see the way clearly back to his heart. May we trust in his ways even when we might not understand them, to be fair, and may we share in his joy every time a lost one comes back to the Father, and may we welcome them back to his family with open arms and warm embrace. Well, thank you for patiently bearing with me this evening as we've gone through this in this fashion, and truly may God bless each one of you. Look forward to seeing you, Lord willing, face to face, well, as much face to face as we get to do when we are Zooming these evenings. But looking forward to seeing you, Lord willing, next Monday night. And then I'm going to be away the next two after that, but more of that a little bit later. Thank you, and may God bless you.